Our speaker for the day is a PhD candidate of the Department of Communication and Culture American Studies program of Indiana University. She takes research interest on cinema theory, history and production, globality, cinema exhibition, new media, perception and audience studies, national cinema, experimental cinema, third world cinema, post-coloniality, media spaces, ethnography, gender and the everyday. She was also an associate instructor in the Department of Communication and Culture, Indiana University. Friends, let us welcome Ms. Jasmine Trice.
Thank you. I'd just like to thank the department and Ma'am Lulu and everyone for inviting me to do the presentation today. It's actually the first time that I've presented this work, which is very much a work in progress. It's basically going to be kind of the framework for my dissertation, which has a working title as of today, it's called Imagined Communities, Imagined Cosmopolitanism, Spaces of Cinema Circulation in Manila, Philippines, 2006 to 2008. And I realize that that's kind of a mouthful, but I thought that it was important to locate the specificity of the project within time to get away from the sort of calls for more diachronic sort of work. So it's kind of a snapshot of independent cinema's circulation within Manila. And the reason that I used imagined communities referencing Benedict Anderson's idea of nation in tandem with this idea of imagined cosmopolitanisms is to sort of look at the way in which nation and internationalism can work sort of together through this lens of independent cinema circulation. So basically what I'm going to do is give a summary of kind of the disciplinary landscape of the project and then go into the methodologies, and then the finished product will be about 4 or 5 chapters long. I'm only going to give sort of an abridged version of the first 3 chapters, and then hopefully have room for questions and comments. I think it would be really great if I could have any sort of suggestions or comments from an audience before I actually leave town, which is next week. So, all right. So the dissertation examines the circulation of quote-unquote alternative cinema in Manila, Philippines. Focusing on this circulation's positioning amid the spaces of the global and the local, it argues that examining the processes of these works' distribution and exhibition within specific sites offers new frames for studying cinema culture in Manila as a post-colonial urban setting. And I'm using the term alternative cinema here specifically because I think independent cinema has a kind of connotation and cadence now that I wanted to sort of broaden. So I'm using alternative cinema, which I'll unpack in a bit. Okay, by examining spaces circulating small-scale works whose modes of production, experimental aesthetics, or radical politics place them at varying degrees of distance from the more commonly examined works of global mass culture, the project endeavors to develop a model of cultural goods circulation oriented around the shifting spectra between global and local, mainstream and alternative. And I'm using circulation here rather than distribution and exhibition as kind of separated, parsed out terms because of the ways in which a lot of the sites that I'm looking at are multi-purpose. Okay, so in terms of the global and the local, within cinema studies, despite the influx of globalization and post-nationalist discourse, for example, Dudley Andrew, who's a noted cinema studies scholar from Britain, notes that in his remapping of world cinema, we still parse the world by nations. And this is probably because within the discipline, nation was very important for cinema studies to gain legitimacy. It started in English literature departments, and in order to sort of justify the idea of studying a movie instead of a novel, one of the sort of strategies that was used was to introduce auteur theory, looking at people like Kurosawa, Hitchcock, Renoir, Satyajit Ray as authors of cinematic texts, even though some of them, like Hitchcock, for example, might work within an industrial system. And ideas of the auteur as representative and bearer of national and/or ethnic identity have been key to the international reception of filmmakers such as Akira Kurosawa, etc., and then within the Philippine context, other sort of heavy hitters like Lino Broca, Ismael Bernal, and of course more recently maybe Diaz or Violante Mendoza, other people like that. So, but other scholars, including Andrew Higson, who's probably the more canonical scholar with this argument, argue that authorship is only one way of conceiving of the links between nation and cinema, which are often prescriptive. So sort of designating what national cinema ought to be, rather than descriptive, what national audiences watch. And of course, Higson is working from the context of England, so he's working within this specific culture of, fair similarity to the US blockbusters that were occupying the multiplexes that he describes in his article. So if you're looking in the Philippines, of course, when you talk about dividing audiences into global cinema and local cinema, while these terms are by no means monolithic, there is a sort of class issue involved, which scholar Rafael Guerrero in 1983, in an anthology entitled Remaking Philippine Cinema. Since its inception here, movies in our national experience have been composed of foreign and local productions, and this is a dichotomy which exists to the present day. Indeed, the situation occasioned in our society a cultural segregation so pronounced that it was possible to distinguish between an audience exclusively patronizing foreign films and another larger, less affluent public frequenting Tagalog movies. And as I'll talk about in a bit, this dichotomy, at least in terms of its imagination rather than necessarily its practice, exists according to some recent studies. Okay, so the other sort of dichotomy that the work sort of tries to engage is this idea of the mainstream and the alternative, which is harnessed a lot, particularly during new cinema's sort of emergent stages. So terms such as gritty, edgy, truthful, resistant, and counter cinema have been used to discuss works dubbed independent, both here in the Philippines and abroad, in reference to their economic, stylistic, or narrative deviations from mainstream filmmaking, a term functioning, as Shoat and Stamp suggest in relation to Hollywood, not to convey a knee-jerk rejection of all commercial cinema, but rather as a kind of shorthand for a massively industrial, ideologically reactionary, and stylistically conservative form of dominant cinema. While useful, this partitioning of works via aesthetic or economic descriptions, I would argue, doesn't fully account for the ways in which they play out in the arenas of reception over time. So, for example, if you take a film like, I don't know, classical Hollywood Douglas Sirk movie from the 1950s, within its location of production, it was considered sort of pop culture, not necessarily something that would be considered high art, but as it developed in the decades following the time of their release, it was sort of elevated to the status of high art because of European critics who sort of appreciated it as such. And another factor that you could talk about as well is exhibition. So, for example, if you might have a picture from the first golden age of Philippine cinema, that is very much embedded in a studio system with a star system, and you play it, on a sheet pinned up in the back of a coffee shop, it might have a different sort of connotation and be informed with a different sort of meaning. So, exhibition offers one productive angle from which to address these categorizations. Okay, so through its focus on one, sites of circulation, and two, alternative cinema, the project aims to contribute to the more common approaches to cinema's global-local interactions, which focus more often on first audiences, which are usually framed around resistant readings, local readings of global texts. And some of this work, for example, might be Leaves and Cats, who are influenced in the 1980s by Stuart Hall's sort of structuralist, semiotic encoding and decoding theory of viewers' engagements with texts. And so, what Hall argues is that there are three options for viewers who are engaging with the text. You can have the sort of hegemonic or dominant mode of engagement, the negotiated mode, or this kind of resistant counter-hegemonic mode of engagement. And so people like Leaves and Cats, who are probably the most, some of the most cited people in television studies, looked at Dallas and how local audiences made use of that sort of global mass culture text and made meaning from it within their specific locations. In this case, in Israel, Los Angeles, Japan.